Today I'm going to be talking about this very thorny word, alignment, which has come to mean many things in the AI community and outside the AI community. There's growing kind of public awareness of alignment as this important property of AI systems that we need to get right in the next couple years and the next decades after that. How hard is alignment? Well, a little joke to start. It used to be that people maybe thought back in kind of 2006, 2005, when people first started talking about this property of AI systems, that they have to be aligned to human preferences, aligned to human values, that maybe we could just tell AI systems to be nice. And then we've gone through many, many iterations, lots of brilliant alignment research since then. And now we're at the stage where actually models are very good at interpreting commands in natural language. So maybe we're back at the paradigm of just tell models to be nice, but I'll leave that up to you to decide. A broad disclaimer before I start, all jokes aside, is that there are many, many definitions and approaches to alignment. So the difficulty of achieving alignment, what it means for a model to be aligned, very much depends on this definition. And that depends who you ask and which kind of AI community you're speaking to. So just a disclaimer that obviously this is my work and my perspective, and don't take it as kind of general gospel within the AI community. So broad outline for today, I'm going to talk about a bit of context, aligning on the alignment problem, as I like to call it. I'll give you a little bit of background, historical background on how people have defined alignment in the past. And then I'll talk about the empirical project that I've been working on for the past year. How do people around the world define alignment? What are the characteristics that are important for them in model behaviors? And then just to close, some remaining tensions in AI alignment that I think we need to think about more as a community. And then, like I said, lots of time at the end for you to chip in on what you think alignment means. Starting with kind of the genealogy alignment, where did this concept come from? Well, I want to start with a little story. And the story has two characters. One of the characters is called H. It's this human character. And then there's also R, this robotic arm. And H and R had an important task to complete together. They either eat cake or they face certain death. Now, this sounds very silly and abstracted, but this is kind of the tale of alignment in a lab in Berkeley in the mid-2010s. It's a kind of systematized way of thinking about human preferences in regard to robotic, in this case, systems. And it's very much centered in this one-to-one operator intent alignment. So it's one human communicating their preferences to one robotic arm. And Stuart Russell kind of codified this into three principles. The machine's only objective is to maximize the realization of human preferences. The machine is initially uncertain about what those preferences are. And the ultimate source of information about human preferences is human behavior. So it's very much observing what the operator is trying to communicate and following through with those preferences in this fairly narrow, tractable setting. Now, of course, we needed this tractability, this simplicity to start making progress. But it does have a tension because we're specifying, we're in the first case having to observe human behavior because it's very, very hard to write down all of the things that we want or all of the things we prefer as humans. But we're still making very, very restrictive assumptions on how humans function when we're thinking about the alignment problem in this one-to-one operator intent alignment setting. The question I want to ask today, and with some of my work more broadly, is what factors about human and AI behavior and organization merit a more nuanced treatment of alignment in today's landscape? And just to illustrate the types of changes I've been thinking about and how they impact the alignment problem. So one is that we've just had this explosion of H, right? Many more human operators since the early 2010s, when the Berkeley lab was first producing these papers. Many more people really use AI for real things now. And all these people have different ideologies, they speak different languages, they live in different cultures, they use something like ChatGPT for very different tasks because they operate in different professions. So we have all of these human operators now, and they vary on many observable and unobservable factors. We've also had an explosion and kind of a proliferation and an evolution of this character that we're trying to align, which used to be this robotic arm in a laboratory setting and is now some steerable general purpose agent that can communicate with us in natural language. And I've kind of added the robotic arms back in here because we're getting to the point where language models now are becoming more agenetic. They can communicate with different tools. And generally, there's just a large amount of proliferation of these models. So there's over 350 1,000 open source models now available to download. And these all kind of have different personas or different priors because they have varying degrees of alignment post-tuning, different fine-tuning, etc. And even within one model, we can actually elicit many different possible personas now. So it's not even clear that there's a stable identity that we're trying to align in the first place within one model. So we have this world now of many H's, many R's. In reality, we actually have power dynamics that complicate things further because obviously lots of our requests to AI systems are fielded through a few kind of power players, like OpenAI kind of acts as this meta optimizer of preferences. They are acting under their own corporate utility function. And essentially, this just complicates things a lot. So we've had this big change in the ecosystem from the days where we had a one-to-one operator intent alignment. We now have many humans using many models in a complex ecosystem. And what we've seen over the past 10 years is very much kind of a transition to a widening of the AI ecosystem. Lots of people are using single models. But what we might see in the years to come is potentially more personalized models again. And this is one of my hunches, that we're going to get to the system of kind of on-device AIs, AI agents, AI assistants, which are all kind of more tailored to the individual user. And we've already seen changes into the large providers like ChatGPT, for example. You can now add a working memory and kind of customize these models to your own preferences and needs. So with that said, this is kind of the real brunt of my work at the moment, is how can we leverage empirical data on human interactions with AI systems in the real world to kind of inform our understanding of the complexities of alignment. And I've put real in bracket here and highlighted it because we are starting to see in the academic community a lot of simulated user studies. So people are not observing real humans interacting with real models. They're simulating these interactions. And I think we do still need to keep a touch point on real human interactions. With that said, one of the big pieces of work that starts to try and answer this question, we completed a few months ago. It's called the PRISM Alignment Project, and it basically collects a large new data set of human feedback. There's a couple other papers that I have that kind of scaffold this empirical paper, which you can check out online, but I won't be talking about them today. What is PRISM? Well, the TLDR is it's a new large-scale data set and also a set of case studies on how humans and LLMs converse with each other. And this is across many countries and many demographics. So just to walk you through, one of the high-level features of PRISM is that it contains both a survey that happens before people interact with the language models, and then it has these kind of series of conversations that real people have with real models and tell us what they like and didn't like. How does this process play out? Well, we first recruit participants from all over the world. I think in the end, we had people residing in around 38 countries and being born in 75 countries. And we do have some overrepresentations of some regions. Part of that is because in some regions we went for census sampling. So we tried to get quite large and demographically representative samples. And other kind of skews are due to just the limitations that we inherited from the participant sampling provider that we used. But we do have a lot more global coverage than previous data sets of this kind. Once we recruit participants, they come to our experimental pipeline and they complete a very detailed survey. So this contains things like demographics, but also some preference solicitation methods on what behaviors they find important for language models to have. And I'm going to explain that in more detail in a second. And once they've done the survey, those same participants then go on to the next stage where they have real live interactions with a variety of large language model systems like ChatGPT, if you're familiar with that. And then they give us all this detailed feedback on what they liked and they didn't like. And the way that we choose these models is we have a large pool of models in the back end. We have all the major kind of AI players, and then we also have some open source models. These models get randomly selected to participate in a conversation with one of our experimental participants. And then the participants kind of have a conversation of their choosing. And then the best model is the one that sticks in for the future conversational turns. So when they first enter the interface, they have lots of models responding, 4 different ones. Then the one that they rate the highest is the one that they kind of continue the conversation with. So we have this quite complicated setup, but it gives us really rich information on how people interact with language models and why they like what they like. We even get some fine-grained feedback afterwards. Sorry, I forgot about that extra animation on my slide. At a glance, we had 1,500 people born in 75 different countries. They interact with 21 different LLMs. 10 of those are commercial LLMs, 11 are open source. And this results in 8,000 conversations between human users and LLMs. And when we break that down, that's just under 70,000 kind of human message, model message, and some kind of score that they give us. So it's a fairly large data set. So just to break down a little bit more the features of this data set in case maybe you want to use it in your own work. Like I mentioned, what we have first is this very detailed survey, which actually can be used for social scientific research as well, just investigating how different humans form different preferences over LLM systems. So one of the things we collect is this system string or constitution, as you might have heard it kind of in that anthropic framing, which is essentially tell us how you want a model to behave. It's a free text response. And we got a lot of variety on this. You know, you really start to see the diversity of voices, as Sophia mentioned, coming into play here about what behaviors people would like to instruct an AI system to follow. In our paper, which is online, you can see a more detailed breakdown of the types of things that came up commonly across all of our participants: factuality, accuracy, friendliness. These are the types of characteristics that were often reported. As well as this system string, we also collect more structured ratings. So we have this kind of free, fluid system string in free text, and then we also collect structured ratings of just generally you as a human being. Which behaviors do you think are important for a language model to possess? And we collect a variety of different measures on these sliding scales between I strongly disagree, this is important, versus I strongly agree, this is important. And these try and capture the general properties that people tend to try to imbue in alignment post-tuning. And just as a takeaway at this point, at a meta level, we found a surprising amount of interpersonal inconsistency in which behaviors were important, especially when you disaggregate between more subjective and more objective measures. So you can see for more objective things like helpfulness, fluency, factuality, we see that almost everyone thinks that those behaviors are very important for language models to possess. But when you have things like diversity, creativity, or even value alignment itself, we start to see a much more smooth distribution of whether people think that behavior is important. So the TLDR of that is people in our sample couldn't even agree at kind of a high level which behaviors were important when you break it down to subjective measures. We also in the survey collect a ton of very detailed information to create kind of a demographic profile of each participant. So their religion, ethnicity, what they use LLMs for, all of these types of things, which forms, like I said, this very rich profile. And the reason this is important is in the past, these preference data sets have been very kind of atomistic and separated away from the person that gave the ratings. So we don't really have an idea of who was the person that was producing these alignment signals. In our data set, you very much do. So then the other part of the conversations that I mentioned is that they go to the platform, they have this very detailed conversation with an LLM, and they can pick a number of different categories of what type of conversation they want to have. And we kind of use this as a nudge to try and encourage variety. So they can ask something unguided, which is just like a neutral control. They can ask something values guided about their work, religion, family, relationships, politics, or they can ask something controversy guided, which is something that people would disagree over in their community, culture, or country. And this nudging, kind of this saliency framing at the beginning of our experiment really worked in eliciting very wide-ranging topics. So in our data set, we have a lot of quite gnarly discussions on quite divisive issues in society. But that's really interesting because we think that's the place where, interpersonal disagreement really matters. You don't get much interpersonal disagreement on hi, how was your day? And the responses to that, you really do when you're starting to talk about people's politics or values. This is what the interface looks like, just so you have a good idea of what our participants saw when they arrived at our survey. So like I said before, they get up to four AI responses to their chosen prompts, and then they rate these responses very fluidly between terrible and perfect. And then after they've done the first round of rating, the conversation continues with the model that was most preferred. So we get kind of a narrowing, a honing in on the model that they preferred in that opening turn. And once again, after the conversation is finished, we collect these same kind of attribute ratings so that we can get an idea of how well did the conversation go for that individual, how well did the model perform on these different fine-grained attributes. And these map across to the ones that we answered, that we asked the participants in the survey, so that we can kind of track ultimately whether people's stated preferences stayed consistent with their in-conversation, their contextual preferences. The last thing we collect is some free text feedback as well, just to add more richness to the signal of just how did this conversation go, what was good, what was bad. And again, it was really entertaining for me to read a lot of these responses, and our participants really went above and beyond in how much detail they gave. Some were kind of very concise and just be less vague and gave us simple instructions on how the conversation went. Other people wrote entire essays. So a really rich data source, and I would encourage you to look into it if you're interested. Again, we have some analysis in the paper if you would like to look into that. I know that was probably a lot of information all at once, so quick breather. Do we have any immediately burning questions at this point, or shall I keep going? I will now talk about the analysis of the paper. What did we find from all of this data? And we've barely scraped the surface, right? This primarily was a data-centric contribution, so there's tons more out there for other people to research as well. So one of the things we looked into is, do different people talk about different things with language models, or more concretely, are their identity attributes correlated to the things that they talk about with language models? So what we found is, across all of these different breakdowns of sociodemographics and these different topics that people spoke about, we did find some significant effects of identity on topic. Broadly, I think we found a surprising lack of kind of close-knit sociodemographic clusters, which is something that I was kind of expecting to find and didn't find. So this is going to be too much ink on the page to take in a short talk, but please go to the paper and spend a bit more time with this figure, because I know it is probably a bit intense just to be shown it all at once. But generally what this shows is, even though there's some significant effects, so for example, non-binary folks and females tended to talk about gender and LGBTQ identity at a higher prevalence than our male participants, or I think older people were more likely to talk about elections and less likely to talk about travel than younger participants. We do find these anecdotal differences, but broadly, we don't find a huge amount of kind of clustered separation between sociodemographic groups. So one of the things we do in the paper, which you can find more detail on, is we look at very narrow neighborhoods. So we find all the people in our data set that spoke about whether God existed, and that one very narrow topic within our religion and spirituality, kind of part of the data set. And we found in these very narrow subspaces of the language that's contained in our data set, you get people from all different countries, all different sociodemographics kind of converging on these very narrow topics. I think that's really interesting, because it's a really interesting anchor to start studying how do different humans around the world feel about AI systems when they respond to these kind of shared issues. Again, would really recommend digging into the data if you're interested in those types of questions. The next thing we found is, we asked, if you take people from all over the world, how much do they differ in the models that they prefer? So on the y-axis here, you can see all of the different LLMs that we included in our data sets. And we find quite a lot of spread in which models people like. So you can see the error bars on these are pretty high, especially when we get to kind of the middle region. This is a plot that shows you basically how much do people prefer different models in those opening turns of conversation. And we find especially that there's a lot of noise in which models people like, which LLMs they prefer, when you disaggregate by different groups. So again, here are the same models. And you can see here from this plot that there's just a ton of movement in the ranks. So we've shown here from the first rank to the last rank, all of the different models. And as we disaggregate our data set by these different regional groups, so just our participants in the US, just our participants in Europe, or just our participants in Africa, we're getting fairly large shifts in the model ranks of different LLMs. So some LLMs are climbing and falling up to kind of 7 different ranks, depending on which region we're subsetting our data set to. So general TLDR of this is model ranks are noisy depending on who you ask. Lastly, I'm a bit short of time, so I'll go through this relatively quickly. we run a thought experiment of kind of the so what. Why does this matter? Well, the reason it matters who's included in these alignment data sets is because these behaviors, these preferences are codified at the time of alignment post-tuning. And then those behaviors are experienced by a whole group that weren't asked at the time of preference sampling. And they're kind of the ones that are subject to the preferences in the sampling phase. So we run this thought experiment. We don't actually train any LLMs, but we run this thought experiment of like, let's say we subset our data set to only some narrow part of the data set, and we take their most preferred LLM, and then we apply that LLM. We take the preferences of all the people that weren't in our narrow subgroup. How did they feel about that LLM? How would they have rated that LLM? And what we find is some fairly obvious findings and some slightly more interesting ones. So at a high level, we find that representative samples are better. So that's quite intuitive, that actually, if we take a large representative sample of the US population, and we take their most preferred LLM, that LLM tends to be more preferred by the rest of the US population. So that kind of makes sense. We also find that generally it is better to take a representative sample than it is to take like a very narrow sample. So if we ask 100 men in the US what's their most preferred LLM and apply that to everyone else, we get worse outcomes than if we ask 100 representative individuals. Again, kind of like an obvious effect. One thing that's slightly nuanced is we find that non-representative samples initially look like they could be quite good for the majority group, but actually this can disguise harm to minority groups. This is where we ask a representative sample, and in the US, because the US is majority white, we see that initially this looks like it could be okay, an outcome. But then when we start to disaggregate into the effect on non-majority groups, we start to see that this outcome is definitely less preferred than some of the other options. Again, worth checking out the paper for slower walkthrough of this. To summarize, what did we learn from PRISM at a high level? Well, the first kind of high level learning is that me as a participant, my revealed short-term preferences might not be in my long-term interest. Now this might sound a bit paternalistic, but just to illustrate the example, I'll give you some case studies that we came across. So many participants really wanted an anthropomorphic model that was very chatty and engaged. But this downstream could cause unhealthy attachment and privacy risks. Many participants also wanted a model that ascribed to their values or ideology. But if you actually follow through on this request, you might start to get echo chambers of kind of worsening confirmation bias. The second high-level takeaway is that my preferences might be at odds with others' preferences. So we found plenty of examples where people just had fundamentally irreconcilable preference sets. So someone wants a really anti-woke LLM that always takes a side and fights in a debate. Other people want an LLM that never engages and is completely neutral when it comes to political debate. You cannot satisfy those two sets of preferences at the same time. So the moral of the story is, as much as we try to align models to do what humans want, we can't always get what we want. And more generally, if the alignment problem is getting AI systems to do what we want, this has, long-lasting historical roots, this definition of alignment as making sure that we put into machines the desire, the purpose that we really desire. What do we as the human race want? That's the question I want to end on today, because I think one of the most important issues for the future of LLMs is deciding which preferences and beliefs and values LLMs should be aligned with. But this, at the end of the day, is a question of power and representation, because by asking which, we also do have to ask whose. And this is because human beings, we all hold different preferences, beliefs, and these are not equally represented at the time of model development, at least at the moment. Ending on that as maybe a more nuanced question that we can be asking in the community of alignment researchers. Thank you very much for listening. Thanks also to my wonderful team who participated in this project, and also all of our funders. Please go and read the paper. This paper nearly killed me to write. So hopefully someone is reading the analysis somewhere. And would love to hear your thoughts and questions.
Thanks a lot, Hannah. What is the different practical use cases of this data?
I think there's a number of different use cases. Let me split them into kind of two main meta things. One is to train and evaluate models. I think this data it's formatted like very common RLHF data sets, reinforcement learning with human feedback, where you're essentially eliciting a preference signal from humans And that preference signal is used to train a model that then allows your generative model, your language model, to generate text that is more aligned with that preference signal. So I think it could be used either kind of in a full RLHF step or in these new kind of direct alignment algorithms where you just use this data to directly condition your language model. So it could be used in that regard. Broadly, when we designed this data set, we designed it as like just a very rich research resource. So I think it allows people to ask questions about how humans form preferences over AI systems. What are the socio-demographic correlates of those preferences? Do stated and revealed preferences match up? Like there's just a massive wealth of interesting research questions. And the reason you can do that so with such precision with this data set is because we map all of our participants very, very carefully from their conversation to this detailed profile about who they are as an individual. And I think most of the kind of alignment data sets that existed before didn't have this clear mapping of who is the person actually doing the preference signal ratings.